Here we go. Hey, what's up, everybody? I decided to jump on again because I was out thinking a little bit out and about my day, and was thinking about some of the new releases came out because I was just talking about the new Planet of the Apes movie, and realizing how there's kind of been a trend starting away from the comic book movies and that kind of genre that's been overtaking a lot of the mainstream cinema for the last 10 years or so, ever since Marvel started. And I was thinking, with Deadpool 3 just being announced, with the success of the Batman and Joker films. Again, the Batman's going to be a franchise, but it was also kind of meant to be a standalone movie. It wasn't part of a ongoing narrative that they had already set up. I thought there's been a lot of talk since the release of the original Deadpool about R-rated superhero movies and what we could expect from studios and stuff like that. And I've been actually surprised. I think a lot of people have, at the lack of response to that. Like, there's been a few, but they didn't really lean into that as much as I think a lot of people did at the beginning when Deadpool was first announced. And now with him becoming part of the MCU official, I know a lot of people are worried about if that's going to kind of nerf his character and his humor a lot. But what I did think about was that it would be a great time to launch the new Spawn movie. Now, I know it had been announced a few years ago that McFarlane was taking the helm and trying to produce his own horror version of the film, which I agree it should be a horror film. Um, and I happened to come across, well, an article from today that pretty much makes all my points for me. So what I thought we'd do is I just kind of scroll through this and we could talk about it, and I could add in my color commentary as we go along. Uh, just let me get it all set up here. Perfect. So, first things first, what I want to talk about is, like I was already mentioning, the fact that we had already seen a lot of standalone comic movies. By the way, there's articles from IGN, so if in case anybody wants to look it up. Um, but like right after Deadpool, or around Deadpool, we had Logan come out, which was another R-rated story, and this kind of segues into my second point, which is you don't also need it to be an origin story, which I think we're starting to crest right now in films. Batman, or The Batman by Matt Reeves, was not an origin story technically. Logan wasn't an origin story. There's a lot of them that still are origin stories, but I think Logan and the Batman specifically, um, and the Joker to an extent, it was an origin story, but it was an origin story for a character that's not supposed to have one. Different conversation, but I'll throw it in the pot anyway. Point is that it proves that you can do, what do I want to say here, mid run stories. You can have an established character that already exists in the universe. We don't have to be introduced to them just because it's the first film. I think Logan and the Batman prove that by taking either latter day stories, like in the case of Logan, or somewhat pre-prime characters like the Batman, and you can tell all kinds of different shades of stories within there as long as you keep the essence of the character strong, and you can keep, um, you know, I think what's developing over this 10-year period of people watching a ton of comic movies is that your general audience is also much more comic literate as well as media literate. So what you have is, if you throw out, say, a Spawn movie in this case, you don't necessarily need to tell people who Spawn is. They're ready to accept, and they know who comic book characters are. Even if they don't know who Spawn is, they've seen comic book movies before. They're a little bit more initiated into the language of these types of stories and the types of characters that they'll see. But that also brings me to my next point, which is you don't necessarily need to make it not just an origin story, but Spawn doesn't need to be the main character. He doesn't need to be the protagonist of the story. In the original run, there's Sam and Twitch, the two kind of detectives that are investigating the crimes and the murders that Spawn he's not causing, but that they know that they're going after similar bad guys, and they could be the general audience's view into the world because they're two human characters, and Spawn is a world of supernatural horrors and powers and all kinds of things like that. He's literally basically a resurrected demon from hell, and he also throughout the beginnings of his story doesn't know the full potential of his powers. He learns them as he goes. So that's kind of a natural arc that you can use to build the suspense and stakes of the ongoing franchise as you continue these stories or whatnot. But Sam and Twitch can be your general audience's view into it, and we can follow them around. I was just telling a friend of mine that in the Joker movie, the two cops that were kind of hunting down the Joker and looking into the murders that he caused, they kind of gave me Sam and Twitch vibes, and I thought they might have been almost based on them. I'm kind of curious if they are. Um, but I think you can tell a really interesting story, kind of a throwback noir film of Sam and Twitch just investigating a serial killer or a series of murders, very much like Seven. We just saw work with Batman. I know people are gonna say, "Oh, you're repeating the same thing." I mean, Spawn is a Batman, very Batman-like character, and I think it would be hard to argue that he wasn't necessarily based on him. He's kind of a mashup of Batman and Doctor Strange, amongst a lot of other things. Um, but my point being is that, like, I think that if you're still worried about it being too much of a comic book movie for most people, you don't, in selling the Spawn aspect of it, sell it as a detective horror story going after a really nasty serial killer, and the supernatural stuff pops up in the background. And I think that is very much aids into the kind of character of who Spawn is, and his first arc of learning who he is, because he has, when he comes back as the superhero, well, super demon, he really doesn't have he has amnesia, so he has to piece together his own backstory, which is a great way to tell that story, but you don't necessarily have to. So I think it works either way. I think you have options there, is kind of what I'm saying. um, I think along with that, you're starting to see, especially with Marvel Phase 4, a lot of MCU fatigue, and maybe not superhero fatigue. I think you're seeing a very certain brand of superhero fatigue, which is this kind of MCU. Let's make light of every dramatic moment. Let's make sure it's chock full of jokes and humor. We can't take, you know, they've destroyed a lot of their own characters. I'm not the first one to say this over the last phase or whatever they're in phase four. I think they've been slowly working against a lot of what they set up with the first, couple of arcs of their story, of their franchise. And I think now is the time to kind of pounce on that if you want to break up their, well, what was seemingly a monopoly on the genre. And I think you can slip in some different and interesting stories while still playing in the market of superhero films that is going to put butts in seats, as people say. You don't necessarily have to go entirely against the grain, but you can do what people want and give it to them in a different way. And I think you're still going to have a really successful story and a potentially really good movie on your hands. I think, and that's part of what I want to get into the article, is McFarlane says in the article that he wants to get the story right. And now, as you can see in the headline, he's brought on writers from Captain America 4 and the Joker, and that's another thing that I thought of specifically, is based on Logan, Deadpool, and the Joker and the Batman. Bring those people on, which they did, obviously, or tell that type of story. So I'm very happy to see that they might be. And I think that they're headed in the right direction in letting McFarlane, quote unquote, run the show, but not necessarily write the script. I think we saw with Frank Miller, Sin City was a great adaptation of a series of comic books, rather, excuse me. But I think we saw with The Spirit that it wasn't necessarily the best idea to let the comic guy run the movie set, which is fine. It can happen. I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, but I just think obviously it worked really well when you had Rodriguez and other guest directors kind of there to steer the ship, guide it a little bit more with a little bit more experience. And as we'll get into in the article, I think McFarlane addresses that as well. And I'm really happy to see that they seem to be doing it right by my standards, I guess you could say. Or by a lot of he wants to make it a horror movie. He wants to get the story right. He wants to service the characters, and I would be really stoked to see a Matt Reeves Batman style slash Joker version of Spawn, because I think it's what everybody wanted, and the obviously the visual effects have caught up with what the '90s couldn't do. It's funny because the comic books in the '90s went really dark and serious, and I think '90s cinema tried to follow that trend as well. Like a lot of things got kind of edgy, real super edgy in the late '80s, early '90s, and funny enough, I think even then, like they did release the Spawn movie, but it was notoriously bad with VFX, and then you get in the same span of a couple of years, you get the Blade movie released, which was an R-rated horror movie, and that would have been your doorway. Like they did it. I can't remember now if Spawn came first or not. So maybe Spawn crawled so Blade could run, but we'll see. People like to forget that movie exists too. But I think that would have been your model for an early '90s Spawn version, and now here's a second chance at letting Marvel kind of pave the path for you to do the movie that you need to do. Because I don't think 10 years ago or even 5 years ago you would have gotten this movie made. It's been in the works since 2009, which is, oh God, 12 years for now. But again, there's a reason it hasn't come out and they haven't shoved it through um, the Hollywood process or whatever. So anyway, with all of that said, I'm gonna go through the article and it's probably gonna repeat some, but let's see what we got here. So Todd McFarlane's Spawn movie has just gained new writers with some major comic book movie pedigree. McFarlane revealed that Scott Silver from the Joker and Malcolm Spielman of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Captain America: New World Order, which we have not crazy about Winter Soldier, or I'm sorry about the Falcon and the Winter Soldier show. That wasn't the greatest, and we'll see what New World Order has to bring. But this article again is just from earlier today, and so it was kind of funny that this all kind of came up at the same time while I was thinking about it. Um, skip down. Oh yeah, he's directing with Blumhouse too, which is very exciting. If people don't know, Blumhouse is the studio responsible for like Saw and their model is very much low budget independent horror films. And what they're in a nutshell, again, I'm not going to deep dive into a analysis with them, but what they'll essentially do is produce 20 low budget horror movies, and then every Saw that they get out of those 20, like they'll all be crap and probably flop, but the one that pops for them will finance all the rest of them. So to get a Spawn, you need to put up with Happy Death Days and all those kind of things in between all those what you would call sludge factory films. Although a lot of people enjoy them, they definitely have their audience. So I'm not here to knock them. I'm just saying that if you want, I'm happy with the low budget indie production house that he chose to go with because I think they're going to get the aesthetic right, and I think they know what they have on their hands potentially, and they're going to want to do this one right so they can make the money and keep making money with more of these movies. So that's also a positive sign. But I believe that's kind of old news at this point as well. Uh, oh, excuse me. The news that the Spawn movie is gaining writers may be seen as a mixed blessing for fans. It's clear that the project is still in early stages. 5 years after McFarlane formally announced it, McFarlane is well aware that Spawn fans are growing impatient at the slow progress, and at this point, he's as frustrated as anyone at the lack of momentum. I certainly get that. I mean, 12 years is a long time to wait for any project to get off the ground. Um, but again, I think it's going to be worth it. I think getting this one right is important, not just to McFarlane, but to fans as well. Again, I'm not a huge Spawn fan. I was introduced, like a lot of people, through the 90s movie, but I always loved the character. And I have read the first trade paperback, the first kind of arc of his story, and it's very, well, it's dark to be sure, but it's also very effective. I think in a day and age where we're getting like the Sandman Netflix show, which I've heard mixed reviews about, but it's going to my point about Logan and Deadpool. Like we've had so many darker shows come out that deal with so much more serious and kind of not just mythological content, but just there's so much content out there now. You can watch. We're just more exposed to foreign films, to different types of stories, to different types of characters, different ways of telling characters. Again, this is not. You don't have to wait for Tarantino to come out with his next movie to find out to see how a different way a story can be told. I'm thinking of Pulp Fiction and just kind of what he's known for with reinventing, cinema techniques and kind of putting a style on it. I think McFarlane obviously is known for having his own signature style, and I want to see that come through in the production. So I think waiting this amount of time, especially waiting for, I don't know a time in the last 10 years that would have been appropriate. And I know I'm kind of repeating myself here, but I don't know what would have been a good time. Like during the MCU craze, it wouldn't have really flown, I don't think. I think as frustrating as it is to have waited, I think you let MCU do the work and take the hit so that you can pick it up and carry the ball over the field goal or over the goal line rather. I think having them just with the technology in the Mandalorian and Star Wars with the new kind of projection screen that Matt Reeves used with the Batman to do digital sets, like it's gonna be a lot better than the green screen hell that we had with the '97 film. I think it was '97. it's just going to be, I think you can get a lot more done on a much smaller budget. And I think the Batman, as epic as that one was at 3 hours and everything it covered, I think a smaller scale Spawn actually will be a lot more effective because you can use him as the shark like in Jaws, right? You don't really show him. There's so much dark shit in Spawn that it's. I mean, you can have all kinds of stuff just lurking around the edges of the story that you don't necessarily have to dip into without you know uh, tipping your hand right away. I guess early on in the movie you can build a lot of suspense and not necessarily lose your audience. I don't think. I think a lot of people are not only just the fans are ready for it, but I think audiences in general are ready for a different type of story. I think the appetite's still there for, and I recently ranted about a Screen Rant article that talked about Batman and this serious take on him not being good because it limits the superhero stories that you can tell with him because you can't fight Superman or whatever. I go watch that video. It's a dumbass take, but Spawn is kind of your Batman with in the supernatural world. Like he's got supernatural powers. His story is directly related to mythology and kind of supernatural. Uh, what am I trying to say here? Abilities and forces at work. Kind of in the Sandman. That's why I brought up Sandman, the John Constantine. Travelers between this dimensions, or if you want to say, I don't know what you call them, realms, planes of existence. And again, like I said, he's also learning about himself as he goes through his own story. So I think that's a interesting take on it, as opposed to having these archetypical characters that are go from one extreme to the other. They go from good to better, or from they don't really. This has been my complaint with the MCU is it's constant second act storytelling. Their stories don't really end. They don't go anywhere. I think with Spawn, you can tell several arcs as he evolves, just like they did with the Batman. Like you can choose different points in his story, and they will be complete stories unto themselves, while the overarching story continues to build and grow, and you expand the world, and that's how you build a franchise, right? That lasts. You build on things that you present at first without trying to force it all in there, like they did with, say, the Justice League movie. Anyway, and this is the line I was talking about. However, McFarlane is also adamant that his ultimate goal is to get the story right, not meet a particular deadline. He revealed that Bloom was responsible for helping him change his perspective on the development process, reminding McFarlane that the Spawn movie will happen when the time is right, not before. And as of right now, Jamie Foxx is still attached to star in the film. Well, that's interesting because I was actually thinking about some casting that I would suggest. I thought came up with if he was still alive, Chitwell. I'm sorry, not Chitwell. Boseman, Black Panther, or Chitwell Ejiofor, who starred in Red Belt. I think he is a really great actor. I think he could have done some really interesting things. Um, but Jamie Foxx is certainly an interesting choice, and I think he's got the draw for one in the name recognition, and I think what I just read gives me a lot of hope and encouragement in that it seems like the team really does care about this, and I think there's um, going to be a lot of support now that you'll see start growing. And again, this article just came out today, so I'll be interested to keep an eye on it and see how things develop from here on out. Um, Silver and Spellman are clearly no strangers to comic book movies at this point. McFarlane noted that Silver's work on Joker in particular made him a logical choice to pen a new screenplay. That film took a relatively low budget approach to the Batman franchise. Now, see, I'll take issue with that. This is a small thing. It wasn't really the Batman franchise. I believe the director Miller in a few interviews had said that we didn't make a comic book movie, which I kind of got ruffled my feathers a little bit. Although I think that's the way Matt Reeves said the same thing about the Batman. Like I think that's the way you kind of want to approach these things. Is you're making a movie. You're not making a comic book, or you're not trying to put the comic book on the screen. You're making a movie first because that's how people are going to experience it. So you have to work within the parameters of that medium. That being said, I think that a comic book movie is a very obviously particular style of genre with its own tropes and rules. So taking a relatively low budget to the Batman franchise, it wasn't really have anything to do with the Batman franchise. It was a bunch of characters, and again, like similar to what they did with the Batman, they grounded everything down. They took all the characters and all the comic bookness and kind of lowered it down to a street level vibe. And I think that's why it was successful because that's how you stand out from the crowd while still waving the comic book flag, I guess, if you will, or keeping it within that genre and getting that recognition. Um, anyway, moving on. So that gels with McFarlane's desire to take a smaller, darker, and more intimate approach to Spawn. Back when filming was expected to begin in 2018, McFarlane envisioned a lean $10 million budget and a story that would treat Spawn more as an imposing background figure than the main protagonist of the story. Oh, that sounds familiar, huh? However, at that point, the film was still relying on McFarlane's own screenplay. Multiple new scripts later, McFarlane has made it clear he has no desire to dictate the story, but instead deferring to Silver and Spellman as they worked and breathed new life into the saga of this undead anti-hero. And then again, that's just reiterating what I said earlier. You know, let McFarlane be there to make sure that everything is on brand and the characters are who they need to be, but let the movie guys do their movie thing, and don't try and bite off more than you can chew. And I really admire the dedication here that they seem to be reporting. Again, multiple scripts. He's got no desire to dictate the story, and deferring to the writers, who again I have to defer to McFarlane's own judgment here on who he chose to let on. But again, Joker and with Captain America, the Falcon Winter Soldier, that's a rough one. But hopefully it was the good writer that he picked. And so the rest of this goes on about the success of Batman/Spawn, which is a comic book movie, which is a whole kind of different topic, but it was just relating the fact that he's kind of coming back into vogue. What I did want to point out is that who was working on it, he was working with Greg Capullo, who worked with Scott Snyder in creating the Court of Owls in the New 52, which was like kind of their first arc of the new Batman, reinvented for the New 52, but they created the Court of Owls, which is this secret society in Gotham who are becoming more and more popular due to their, because they're great characters and a great story, but they're becoming more popular, and I think they're a great set of antagonists to set against a lot of these more grounded Batman stories. And I think Greg Capullo in particular, he's the artist for that run, and I think him and McFarlane working together. I'm excited for the comics, but I like where McFarlane's head at, which sounds super arrogant, but him working on that taking off in popularity, coming out at the same time. Oh no, did I lose it? No, went blank for a second. Anyway, I think the popularity of that and it being that still upcoming in the comics is going to lend to the growing popularity of Spawn. It's going to introduce the character obviously to a lot of new people. If it's successful, that will build momentum for the film. That'll get people obviously being teamed up with Batman, who's an iconic character. It's going to make it a little bit more generally acceptable to a wider audience. It'll get help. I mean, only because I'm not a huge Spawn fan. I haven't seen him mentioned in a ton of mainstream media as of late. So anyway, that's it. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention and let me know what you guys think, or if you're excited, what you think of McFarlane's choices, if you think it's going to be good. Are you worried about the Falcon Winter Soldier writer? And where do you think this is all headed? I'm excited to see a low-budget horror Spawn movie. Don't mess it up, guys. All right, guys. Have a good one. I'll catch you on the next one.